Hi everyone, welcome back to our lecture on the treatment of abstractness in phonological representations. So on the basis of the Turkish data, we've seen that we have this problem whereby we have some stops that exhibit alternations between voiceless and voiced stops, but it's not possible to choose either a voiceless or voiced sound for the underlying representation. Therefore, following the proposal of Inglis, we're going to try to see how the analysis works if we assume an underlying abstract sound which is underspecified for voice, a sound that has all the same features as a stop at a given place of articulation, but which doesn't carry the necessary specifications for the feature voice. So we're going to need, in order to generate these paradigms, some rules, namely, as we did with Spanish, a rule which will generate one of the allophones under some specific conditions, and another rule which will generate the other allophone under another specific set of conditions. So since it looks like here is where the professional forms can come into helping us in the analysis, since it looks like the allomorph that occurs in the professional suffix is dependent upon the voicing value of the stem final consonant, we need some kind of progressive voicing assimilation rule. It won't matter whether we choose tu or ju for the underlying form of the professional suffix, but we'll be able to generate the correct allomorphs using this progressive voicing assimilation rule. So we'll name our rule progressive voicing assimilation. And this rule will state that an obstruent, so a non-sonorant sound, will take on the voicing values, alpha voice. Remember, for assimilation rules, we use the Greek variables, when it is preceded by an obstruent which has some given value for voice. So here we have our progressive voicing assimilation rule, and we can quickly see that see how that applies in the professional forms. Here, let's assume for the moment that the professional form has the underlying representation tu, and therefore we will see voicing assimilation actually applying in forms where there is a voiced obstruent here, and thus when progressive voicing assimilation applies, then we obtain a voiced affricate ja in these forms. And nothing will need to happen here if we assume the underlying representation tu for the suffix. And now, crucially, this tells us that in the professional forms of the alternating stems, that these are going to have to obtain a voiceless obstruent before progressive voicing assimilation applies. So if we have here these underspecified forms have an obstruent which has the value 0 voice, progressive voicing assimilation would have a very strange effect here, in that, as the rule is to be interpreted, it would create an underspecified obstruent here if it actually had the chance to apply. So an underspecified affricate of some kind. I'm not quite sure how to write this. I haven't thought until right now of how to write this, but there would be an underspecified affricate of some kind if progressive voicing assimilation applied here. So this tells us that when we have, when a stem has an underspecified obstruent, that there needs to be some process that will transform that underspecified obstruent into a voiceless obstruent. So that applies to both the coronals, and we can see that in the case of labials too here, and should apply for, I think or hope there, yes. There's an example with the affricate, so bakrach alternating with bakradu, and in the professional form it becomes bakrachu. So this means that our voice, our underspecified obstruent here, will need to become voiceless before progressive voicing assimilation applies. So what is our rule here? Very often in these sorts of underspecification analyses, there is a process which will fill in a default value for the underspecified sound if no other process has already applied. So we'll call this the default voicing specification. And the default voicing specification will simply say that an obstruent which is that has no voice feature, so zero voice, will become minus voice. So the default voicing specification will apply here and create the voiceless obstruent. And in that way, we can derive the nominative forms of the alternating cases. So the nominative form here of our first word would have the underspecified coronal obstruent, which then by default voicing specification becomes a voiceless obstruent. The last step in our analysis will then be to establish some conditions under which we generate the voiced obstruent. And we can see that all of the instances in which we have the voiced obstruent, it occurs between two vowels. So as far as the data is concerned, we can have, this will be our sort of more specific specification for these underspecified, our underspecified phoneme. It will become voiceless in the context where it occurs between two vowels. And just as was the case in the Spanish abstract analysis, where diphthongization needed to apply before tensing, because the tensing rule has no environment for application, it will target any vowel whatsoever. Here, similarly, the more specific rule needs to apply first. We'll call our rule intervocalic voicing. And intervocalic voicing will state that in the, for instance, accusative singular form of this word with the underspecified coronal obstruent, we will obtain in a voiced obstruent. Voiced duh. And then the default voicing specification process can't apply. Here, intervocalic voicing is irrelevant. Similarly here, intervocalic voicing is unable to apply in the professional form. And in the professional forms of the other two words, nothing happens, of course. And lastly, the progressive voicing assimilation, nothing actually happens here since we have a sequence of two voiceless obstruents, and there's nothing that can occur in the nominative or accusative forms of this first word either. So that's the essence of our analysis. We required a process of voicing assimilation in order to generate the allomorphs of the professional suffix. And then the other crucial ingredients of the abstract phonemic analysis were to have a default specification rule, a rule that sort of fills in, adds the remaining information for the underspecified phonological feature, and a process which otherwise creates the other possible option under more specific phonological conditions. That was just like the Spanish case, where diphthongization applied under the more specific conditions, namely when the vowel was stressed, but under the more general conditions, these lax mid-vowels were subject to becoming tense vowels. Okay, now that we've seen how the Turkish rule works, we can sort of summarize what happens in the abstract analysis as a whole. So we can, in a sense, say the principle works as follows. The underlying form in such cases is whatever sound is needed to derive all of the surface forms with regular rules. The issue is that then this permits a lot of freedom in selecting the underlying representations. So we are no longer restricted to choosing allomorphs that occur just on the surface. Our choice of allomorph is not just restricted to one of the allomorphs that actually is pronounced, but it could potentially be really anything. And that might be a little bit troubling. And as we've seen in the Turkish analysis, it even goes so far as to posit underlying sounds which would be totally unpronounceable, not even sounds that simply don't occur in the language, but sounds that literally could not occur or be pronounced in any human language whatsoever. So that's actually another crucial distinction between the Spanish and the Turkish cases. In the Spanish case, there were sounds posited, vowels that don't ever occur on the surface in Spanish, in words of Spanish, but which are perfectly normal vowels which occur in many other human languages. On the other hand, obstruents, which are not specified for voice, are not a sort of sound that do or can exist in any human language. So that should be a troubling, perhaps a troubling or worrisome aspect of the Turkish analysis. And but the common thread, the common feature of both the Spanish and the Turkish analyses is that both of these analyses simply posit elements in underlying forms that are never pronounced in any surface allomorph. Okay, so I've just now already raised some issues with such abstract analyses. In the last part of our lecture, we'll talk about some further issues with abstract analyses, and finally turn to some possible analytical alternatives that can save us from having to work with abstract underlying representations.